Hi, welcome to week 7 of Christian Community Development and the Social Justice Tradition. This is Andrew Sears, and this week I'm going to talk about social class-centered justice traditions, including gospel rescue missions, the Salvation Army, and Christian global relief organizations. Another way of characterizing this, these are typically called ministries that are focused on the poor or charities. But the reason why I describe them as social class-centered justice organizations is to kind of fit them into this grid that we've talked about throughout the course across race and class. So what makes them unique is by their mission. They're focused often on the poorest of the poor, the destitute, and a common diagram that you might see is their funders often are going to be kind of coming from the rich white background. Their clients are down here. And really you have two different types of rescue missions in these organizations. One is where they're going to be more lower middle and working class dominant. So their leadership is going to come from this quadrant. But then also, and much more common in the global humanitarian aid or global relief organizations, is it's going to be upper middle class dominant. And often in these organizations, it's white dominant, not always, but most often. And you might see more middle class folks in a lot of these global humanitarian aid organizations. And one thing that's important to recognize right now is the United States overall, in the world overall, is increasingly, I would say, kind of gentrifying to a certain extent, to where there's a lot of pressure to move more to an upper middle class dominant framework. So there's some rescue missions that are saying, no, we're going to stay with these roots. And then there's others that are saying, no, we're going to professionalize and, we're going to take focus more on the upper middle class. So let me talk about what the unique role is within the framework. So the unique role is ministry with the poor to get resources to the poorest. The class background, it's ministry with the poor. Mission strongly focused on transferring resources over the poor. As I mentioned before, they're going to maintain strong class identification. So even if it's someone who's coming from an upper middle class background, they're going to be downwardly mobile or downwardly identifying. But also often they'll promote control over education to avoid class assimilation and raising up leadership from within, so that they don't essentially, gentrify. And a lot of these organizations have amazing levels of class access to the upper classes to redistribute resources. And they do not promote class consciousness. Their framework, as I described, rather than being a race-centric framework like the Black Church, it's class-centric. And the funding model is that those providing funding are in a different cultural group than those being served, creating attention. So let me just talk about the three main categories, and there's more than this, but there's rescue mission, so independent, non-denominational, evangelical, parachurch organizations serving the homeless and the addicted. So the first one was started by Jerry McAuley in 1872 in the United States, and in the U.S., there's 300 plus evangelical Christian ministries that would identify as rescue missions. Typically, they serve around 40 million meals a year to people to help who are homeless or need food. Provide over 15 million nights of lodging, and they typically will have around 18 to 20,000 people that are in long-term addiction recovery programs. And the association used to be called the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions, is now called Citygate. City Vision grew out of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions. It was founded in 1998. It got accredited in 2005. And then in 2008, they realized we need to serve much more than just rescue missions. And even though our roots came from rescue missions and our, at our core, a lot of our evangelical values come out of that. We also serve others, in Salvation Army and others that have similar missions. So the Salvation Army is a global evangelical social service organization started by William and Catherine Booth in 1865. It's both a church denomination and a social service organization, so that's a distinctive compared to rescue missions, whereas rescue missions are parachurch organizations, most of them. And the Salvation Army is a centralized, monolithic structure compared to independent rescue missions. So the general has authority over the entire Salvation Army in this, the way it operates, and all of them are part of one organization globally, versus rescue missions. Each one is independently organized and there's no central structure. They're just a part of an association. So each year in the United States, the Salvation Army serves 58.4 million meals, provides 10.8 million nights of shelter, has 200,000 people in rehabilitation centers, and helps more than 30 million Americans annually with 3.5 million volunteers, 7,500 centers of operations, including 1,200 thrift shops. It's been said that every zip code has some sort of Salvation Army facility in the United States, and that's the only nonprofit that does that. So if you wanted to read more, you can read more at the Salvation Army's annual report. And then another category is the Christian Global Humanitarian aid organizations or global relief organizations. So these are organizations that are primarily focused on disaster relief and extreme poverty globally. So examples: World Vision, Compassion International, Samaritan's Purse, and these are huge globally. So globally, faith-based NGOs represent 60% of U.S.-based foreign aid organizations. The majority of faith-based NGOs are Christian, and World Vision's the largest U.S.-based international relief and development organization with more global employees than USAID. That's the government. All the government's aid, care, and Save the Children combined. Now, there's others out there. There's Catholic charities, there's others, and many of you are familiar with Mother Teresa. I would say she, is in a similar tradition in the Catholic Church. So what's the strengths of these tradition? Can serve the poorest the best, and most effective at meeting the needs of the spiritual needs and immediate physical needs of the poor. And whenever I say the poorest, I'm talking about extreme poverty, the poorest of the poorest, someone who's about to starve, someone who's about to die of lack of water or other things. It's important to recognize that charity plays an important role. So it helps transfer resources to those who need it the most. They're also very effective in addiction recovery and rehabilitation. They create a strong community of multiracial staff and clients from working class and the poor. So that again is saying, that class-centric, spanning race. Most of them have a rich history and deep ties in churches and social capital of many cities. Many of them have been around for more than 100 years in a city. They're outstanding at fundraising to individuals. I was talking with someone from Denver Rescue Mission, and they said that the previous year they received donations from 600,000 people in their city. And they often have very strong administrative and bureaucratic systems. And I say bureaucratic in a positive sense, and that the system can kind of run itself. And they're also really good. Whenever I spent a summer as summer staff at a rescue mission, I felt like, man, this is a group of people. And often I heard this said, we just try to love people into God's kingdom. So there also is a big tension between some perspectives on justice and some perspectives on charity. So, we talk about these four quadrants. So you have this personal, you have vertical reconciliation with God, horizontal reconciliation between individuals, healing racial trauma, addressing all these issues, and then the physical needs, and the cultural needs and societal needs. And the typical focus of charity organizations is going to be this top half. They're going to be focusing largely on the individual. And there is a lot of tension. So the focus on these advocacy-based justice traditions, and often these organizations will try to take control of the term justice and say, we're the only true justice people. In this course, that's not what we believe. We believe justice is all four quadrants, but often there's this distinction between charity and justice, or advocacy-based justice. And, often what happens is there's a judgment between these two groups. So these advocacy justice focused folks say, you're not solving the root causes. And then the charity-focused approach, it says that you're focused on the social gospel rather than salvation. And I want to talk about a personal story from my own experience. So I went to Cape Town, South Africa. I worked at a rescue mission there that they worked with street kids. And our shelter for street kids had about 12 kids there. And most of them had lived on the streets. They're around 12 years old. Most of them lived on the streets from, anywhere from 2 to 6 years at that point. And, I was told that there was 10 to 20,000 kids on the street in Cape Town, South Africa. And I remember that whole summer, I was like, we're serving 12 kids in this shelter, or maybe more. We visited a bunch of other shelters, and, the total capacity in the city for housing street kids in that city was less than probably 200 kids. And then there is another 10,000 that were living on the streets. And I remember leaving there feeling like it was kind of hopeless. You're helping these few people, but there's 10,000 kids on the street. And I came back over a decade later, and I asked the director of the program, I said, what's happened? And they said two things. One, the 12 kids, and I asked, what happened with all these 12 kids? And he said, actually, all of them have died, and they're all horrible, violent deaths. That made me even more discouraged. So then I talked to his supervisor, and I said, have you changed your strategy at all, given it feels like you're kind of losing the war? And he said, yeah. And a matter of fact, we partnered with the city, and we started to take a more of an advocacy-based approach. And now there's less than 800 kids on the street at any given time. Ultimately, they eliminated more than 90% of the problem. So, it's one thing to save these kids after they've been on the street, and that's something good, but it's even better if you can keep 90% of them from being on the street. And ultimately, that's what they did. And that shows the difference between this advocacy-based approach and a charity-based approach. So let me just talk about that a little bit more. So charity versus justice. So charity directs services, food, clothing, shelter. Justice is social change. Advocacy-based justice. Relief addresses immediate needs. Development's long-term needs. Charity is private individual actions. Justice is public collective actions. So charity, homeless shelter, food programs, disaster relief. Justice, legislative advocacy, political action, boycotts, and protests. So strengths are going to be an effective personal salvation and recovery, best at serving the most destitute. The strength of justice is economic development and political change, and to decrease how many are destitute. So the example I use among the street children. So once they've been on the street, you need the charity, but to decrease the number of children on the street, you need advocacy, right? Charity is often judged for not solving the root causes, and justice is often judged for the social gospel rather than personal salvation. So, what's it good for? Charity is good for those who don't have power to change social systems. So for the poor, if someone's homeless, they're not going to be changing the social system, right? At least for a while. So later they might, but you have to help, get them through a rehabilitation program. And justice is good for those who have power to change social systems. So honestly, justice is a better approach for those who are in dominant classes, right? In the rich and the upper middle class. So let me talk about, this critique. So charity versus justice, class consciousness, and being apolitical. So what happens is upper class groups often paternally paternalistically judge lower class dominant groups that are apolitical, like groups like rescue missions or the Salvation Army. And whenever I say apolitical, it's basically in avoiding that fourth quadrant. It's like we're not going to try to change policies. There's a lot of reasons for being apolitical. Frequently, it's unsafe for lower class focused groups to be political due to extreme oppression. So especially in Latin America, if you look at their history of political volatility, if you get involved in politics, then you might end up, for much of their history, and you get on the wrong side of a political party, you may be dead or severely oppressed. So that's a lot of the reason for the apolitical nature. In the U.S., there's McCarthyism in the U.S. and suppression of class consciousness. So that's, those are some of the reasons. And another reason is that charities play a wealth transfer role between the rich and the poor. And many funders are apolitical, so they won't fund organizations that are political. So they avoid funding political action in general, but often it's political action that might hurt their interests. So often it's important to recognize that being political and being class aware often go together. So it's usually, those that become political and become class aware, it's usually done by those who gain class access. So they get educated, but they retain their class identification with the poor. So this is something that I feel like I've done. What happens is through that education, they have increased power. And what that does is it allows them to cope with, I list hostility, but I think a better way of framing that would be class assimilation. So I think one of the principles here applies for these social class focus groups or groups focused on the poor is to respect a group's perspective, determine for themselves whether they're going to focus on, this justice or advocacy-based charity. I think what's important is to recognize that all four quadrants are important, but to not judge groups that aren't in your quadrant. And the reality is most groups can't be, great at all four quadrants. So hopefully this is a helpful perspective. And if you have any questions, ask your faculty member. Thanks a lot.